Hello everyone. Before we jump in, make sure to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's get started. I grew up in East Tennessee, and back then life was a whole lot different than it is now. We didn't have phones in our pockets, we didn't have internet keeping us entertained, and we sure as hell didn't sit inside wasting days away. We had land, we had woods, and we had more freedom than kids probably should have been trusted with. I was about 13 when this happened, maybe a little younger, but old enough to know better. My family lived on a horse farm that bordered a massive stretch of forest and a wide, well-known river. Our parents raised quarter horses and grew a few vegetables, but it wasn't some big farming operation. Mostly, it was a place for us kids to run wild. I had 4 younger brothers, and then there was Jason, the neighbor kid who was a couple years older than me. He was the kind of kid that you couldn't help but think was missing a screw. Brave, reckless, maybe both. He did the kind of things most of us only joked about. Where I would feel that instinctive pull back when something felt wrong, Jason always leaned in. He was the one who wanted to push boundaries, who dared us to go further, who laughed when the rest of us hesitated. In hindsight, that combination was probably a big part of why what happened that day still haunts me. We spent most of our time roaming those woods, hunting squirrels and rabbits, fishing when we could, exploring every ridge and hollow until we knew them like the backs of our hands. The only rule we had was that we weren't supposed to cross the culvert that ran under the road at the river. On the other side was TWRA land, Wildlife Management Area, and technically we weren't allowed to hunt there. My parents didn't want us getting into trouble with game wardens, so the line was drawn at that culvert. But rules meant little to kids in the early 90s, especially when adventure was calling. We crossed plenty of times. At first it was just to explore. Later, when we got more confident, it was to hunt. We never got caught, and after a while it became normal. The land across the culvert had a different feel to it, wilder, less touched, like it belonged to something older than people. I don't know how to explain it, but you could feel it when you were out there. That particular day, we had gone farther than we'd ever gone before. I remember the air being heavy and hot, the way late summer afternoons can be when the air sticks to your skin. Sweat made my shirt cling to my back, and the mosquitoes were relentless. The woods were thick, the ground damp in places where shade kept the sun from drying it out. It smelled of pine sap, wet earth, and that faint musty odor of leaves breaking down on the forest floor. We had no real plan that day, just that restless energy that made us want to keep going, to see what was further in. We were trudging along when one of my brothers stopped and pointed out something strange ahead. It was a small stand of pines, maybe 24 trees or so, but the thing that froze us in our tracks was how they looked. Every single one of them, tall, probably around 14 feet when whole, had been broken off cleanly at about 8 feet up. Not cut, not storm damaged in the way you usually see. Snapped. And every broken top was laid out, angled in the same direction, deeper into the woods. It was so unnatural that it sent an immediate jolt through me. I can still feel it when I think about it. My stomach dropped, my skin prickled, and I felt this deep sense of dread. I can't really explain why it rattled me the way it did. Trees break all the time in storms. I'd seen plenty of wind damage before. But this was different. Too uniform, too deliberate, like something had snapped them by hand and placed them that way. My gut screamed that we had no business being there. I wanted to turn around and go back before we even got closer. But Jason, of course, laughed. He called us babies, said it was probably just a tornado or something, and that we should check out what the trees were pointing at. He wanted to push across the clearing beyond the thicket and see what was on the other side. 2 of my brothers, still young enough to think Jason hung the moon, wanted to follow him. I argued, my voice shaky, telling them we should just leave. But they were already moving, and I was stuck between not wanting to be left behind and knowing in my bones that we were stepping into something we shouldn't. Against everything in me, I followed. The clearing was small, maybe 50 feet across. The grass there was waist-high, swaying with the occasional breeze, and the light cut down through the canopy in strange shafts that made everything look uneven. The woods beyond seemed darker, like the trees were packed tighter. As soon as our feet hit the open space, I heard it, the sound of something big moving through the woods behind us, back where we had just come from. Branches snapping, leaves rustling in heavy bursts, not the kind of noise a deer makes when it bolts, not the slow methodical sound of a person walking. Something heavier. My chest tightened instantly. My brothers laughed nervously, and Jason called me a pussy, but I couldn't shake it. My whole body was screaming at me to run. I backed up, deciding I'd rather be called a coward than ignore what I was feeling. I started circling wide, trying to head back toward the trail that would lead us home. My angle put me about 50 yards off from the thicket, but I could still see them clearly. That's when it happened. The first thing was the screaming. Not from whatever was out there, but from my brothers. High-pitched, panicked, not the kind of scream you fake to mess around. I whipped my head just in time to see Jason, my older, reckless neighbor, fly. He was airborne, his body flipping awkwardly before he slammed into the ground a good 20 feet from where he had been. My brothers were crying, stumbling, running toward me, their faces twisted in terror. Then I saw it. At first my mind couldn't even process what my eyes were seeing. It stepped into the clearing, and it wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Tall, towering over us, at least 10 feet if not more, broad shoulders, long arms, and covered head to toe in jet black hair that caught the sunlight in patches. Its face, I barely remember, almost human but distorted, heavy brow, wide jaw. The sheer size of it was impossible to believe. Before I could take in more, it let out a sound. A scream unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. It wasn't just a noise. It was a vibration that rattled my bones, a roar and a shriek mixed together that you felt in your chest more than in your ears. My legs moved on instinct, pumping hard as I ran like my life depended on it. My brothers were already ahead of me, scrambling, tripping, pulling each other along. Jason somehow was up again, clutching his shoulder and stumbling, but moving with a kind of desperate speed only fear can give. We didn't look back. Not once. Branches whipped our faces, briars tore at our clothes, but none of it slowed us down. We ran until our lungs burned, until our sides split with pain, until the woods thinned and we recognized the familiar line where our property began. The second our feet crossed onto our side, we collapsed, heaving, gasping, sobbing. We lay there in the dirt, too scared to even speak, every one of us certain we'd just escaped something we weren't supposed to see. But then, as we were trying to pull ourselves together, it came again. That scream. Closer this time, echoing across the trees, vibrating in our chests. We froze, staring at each other with wide, wild eyes, and then we scrambled up again, half crawling, half running until we reached the safety of the open field by the barn. We didn't stop until the farmhouse was in sight. Jason's collarbone was broken clean through. His shoulder hung at a sick angle, and he could barely move his arm. We told our parents he'd fallen out of a tree, that we'd gotten scared and panicked. None of us dared to say the truth. What could we have said? That something not human had picked him up like a rag doll and thrown him 20 feet through the air. That we'd seen a creature taller than any man alive. Nobody would have believed us. We never went back across that culvert. Not once. Whatever curiosity we had for the woods on the other side died that day. Even now, decades later, I won't set foot in those woods. I'm 41 years old, and the memory hasn't dulled. Jason won't talk about it at all. If you bring it up, he shuts down, changes the subject, or flat out leaves. My brothers and I still talk sometimes, quietly, when we're alone about that day. None of us doubts what we saw. It left a mark on us, one that never faded. I can still see the snapped pines, all pointing in the same direction. I can still hear the scream that rattled the marrow of my bones. I can still picture Jason flying through the air like he weighed nothing. And I can still remember the raw, primal terror that told me we had stumbled into something older, stronger, and far more real than anything we were prepared for. We told everyone for years it was just a fall, just a scare. But the truth is, something lives in those woods, something I'll never forget. And that day, it made sure we understood we weren't welcome. The summer of 2018 was one of the hottest summers the first can remember. Everything felt baked under the sun, the fields dry and golden, and the smell of cut grass and dust hung in the air all day. I was 13 at the time, and I remember that summer in a way that feels sharper than others, like every sound, smell, and detail stuck in my mind because of what happened. My uncle had asked me to ride along with him while he baled hay. It wasn't unusual. I liked being out in the fields, liked the feeling of sitting in the cab of the John Deere 6R, high up, watching the land stretch out all around. I always felt older sitting in the buddy seat, like I was being trusted with something more important than I deserved. That afternoon, the sun was high and unforgiving, heat radiating off the glass of the cab. Sweat gathered on my forehead, even though the tractor's air conditioning was working, and every few minutes I'd wipe my hands down my jeans. The smell inside the cab was a mix of oil, dust, and the faint sweet scent of the hay. The baler thumped and rattled behind us, and every time it tied a bale and spit it out, I felt a strange sense of accomplishment, as if I had been the one doing the work. We had made good progress. Half the field already looked neat and organized, square bales scattered behind us in a tidy pattern. The rest of the field stretched ahead, the rows waiting to be collected, the stubble prickly and stiff under the sun. It was peaceful in its own way, the steady hum of the engine, the rhythm of the baler, and the quiet weight of the afternoon pressing down on everything. Then it happened. The sound was nothing like the usual thuds and rattles of the baler. It was sharper, harsher, a terrible crashing noise that cut through the air like metal tearing against metal. My whole body jumped at the sound. My uncle reacted instantly, his hand going to the controls, his body tense. He muttered something under his breath, leaned forward, then slowed the tractor. The baler had jammed or something worse, I thought. He stopped the tractor and got out, the door slamming shut behind him. I stayed in the buddy seat, my legs twitching nervously. I could see him walking toward the baler, his shoulders hunched as if he was already frustrated. Dust clung to his shirt, and his hat shaded his face, but I could still see how he leaned down to look closer at the machinery. What I didn't know at first was that he hadn't switched off the PTO. The power takeoff was still spinning, hidden beneath shields and shafts, humming with dangerous energy. I didn't notice until he bent lower and shifted his weight, one hand reaching out. Then it happened so fast I can still barely piece it together. A bit of loose clothing, a corner of his shirt, or maybe the hem of his sleeve snagged. The PTO grabbed it in an instant, and suddenly his body lurched forward. His legs slipped under him, and I saw his arm jerk violently as the machine tried to pull him in. For a second, I froze. 13 years old, my heart hammering so hard I thought my chest would split open. Then instinct kicked in. I threw the cab door open so fast it slammed against the side of the tractor. My boots hit the dry stubble of the field, and I sprinted toward him. The sound of the machinery seemed louder than ever, the whir of the shaft, the grinding noise of his clothes tearing. I grabbed him around the shoulders and yanked back with everything I had. I wasn't strong, at least not compared to him, but adrenaline surged through me in a way I had never felt before. His body resisted, caught in that terrible pull, but then suddenly it gave, and he stumbled backward with me. I fell hard onto the stubble, the dry stalks scraping my arms, and he landed partly on me, groaning in pain. I looked down and saw his foot, or rather, what was left of it. Blood soaked his boot, dripping onto the ground, dark and thick. The shape of his foot was wrong, twisted, shredded. My stomach turned, but I didn't have time to think about being sick. He was breathing fast, his face pale and strained, sweat pouring down his temples. Panic hit me hard then, because I realized I had no phone. My uncle hadn't brought one either, and the farm was at least 10 minutes away by tractor, longer by foot. I stared at the tractor, at the key still in the ignition, and I knew what I had to do even though the thought of it scared me almost as much as what had just happened. I had driven little bits before, moving the tractor in the yard under his careful instruction, but never anything like this. Never alone. Never down narrow country lanes. But there was no choice. He needed help, and I was the only one who could get it. I told him, well, not in words, but in my mind, I would come back. Then I scrambled into the cab, my hands shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to grab the steering wheel properly. The seat felt too big, the controls intimidating, but I remembered enough. Key forward, clutch down, gear, throttle. The tractor roared, and I jolted forward too roughly at first, bouncing hard as the wheels bit into the ground. The drive was a blur, but every detail burned into me. The lanes were narrow, twisting, with hedges on either side that scraped against the mirrors if I got too close. My arms trembled as I gripped the wheel, and every corner felt like it could be the one where I lost control. The tractor was loud, its engine rattling through me, but underneath it I could still hear echoes of that awful sound from the field, still see his foot in my mind. I pushed harder than I should have, the big machine bouncing over potholes, dust trailing behind me. Sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't dare let go of the wheel to wipe it away. The thought of crashing, of wasting precious time, drove me forward. I don't know how many times I muttered to myself that I couldn't screw up, not now. Finally, after what felt like forever but couldn't have been more than 10 minutes, I saw the farmyard. The sheds, the house, the familiar gravel drive. I slammed the brake too hard, the tractor jolting to a stop, and I leapt down, legs wobbling from the adrenaline. I ran across the yard, shouting, waving my arms, desperate for my mum. She came running, and after that, things blurred again. Adults took over. My mum, calm in a way I never could have been, rushed to him, stopped the bleeding as best she could. Emergency services were called. The wait felt endless, the sound of the approaching sirens both terrifying and relieving at the same time. They saved him, but not all of him. He lost most of his right foot that day. The damage was too severe, the machinery too unforgiving. He would never walk the same again, never work in quite the same way. For me, it was a lesson that cut deeper than I realized at the time. At 13, I had always thought of myself as a kid, someone who only helped out here and there. That day forced me into a role I wasn't ready for but couldn't escape. Driving that tractor alone, knowing every mistake could cost us everything, was the scariest thing I had ever done. But I did it. Even now, years later, I can still hear the sound of that PTO, still see the field, the dry stubble scratching my arms, the way the dust hung in the air. I can still feel the fear of those country lanes, my hands slippery with sweat on the wheel. And I can still feel the relief when I saw the farmyard come into view, knowing I had done just enough to get him help. That summer marked me. It changed how I saw farming, how I saw machines, and how quickly life can change in a single careless moment. My uncle still limps, but he's alive. And sometimes, when I walk past the tractor or hear the baler running, I think back to that day in 2018, to the moment I had to be more than just a kid, and I realized just how close we came to losing him. I grew up around cattle. That was just life for us. We had pastures scattered up and down the road in both directions from the house, and it seemed like no matter the season, there was always something that needed to be done. Fences sagged, water froze, weeds grew, calves got out. The work never ended, and when I think back on it, it all blurs together into one long stretch of chores and dust and the low sound of cows calling out across the fields. But there's one particular pasture that sticks in my head more than the rest, not because it was better or worse to work in, but because of the strange, unsettling feeling I'd get there. It wasn't a big pasture, not compared to some of the others. Maybe 40 acres or so, mostly grass with a pond near the middle, and patches of woods edging the fence lines. But on one side, along the far stretch, it bordered an 80-acre block of solid, unbroken timber. No roads, no trails, no houses. Just thick, tangled woods. And beyond that was Corps of Engineers land, more woods, more land no one really went into unless they were hunting. That was the part that always unsettled me. Most of the places we kept cattle were bordered by other farms or pastures, maybe a county road, maybe a field. You always felt like you were close to somebody, even if you weren't. But that side of the pasture was different. You could stand on the ridge and look into those woods, and it just felt like you were staring at something endless. We used that pasture a lot, and it was often enough that we'd be out there on a tractor, hauling feed, dropping off salt blocks, fixing a gate, whatever needed doing. And every so often, for no obvious reason, the cattle would bunch up and spook. They'd put distance between themselves and that fence line, sometimes even running out toward the middle of the field, then settling into this tense half-circle, all of them facing the trees. Ears forward, heads up, tails flicking. It was one of those things you noticed right away, because cattle aren't subtle when they're scared. And what always struck me was how deliberate they looked when they did it. They weren't just scattered, they were holding a line, almost like they knew they needed to keep their eyes on the woods. It wasn't the kind of thing you only saw once or twice. It happened enough that I can still remember the sight of it clearly, cattle in a wide line with that backdrop of dark trees. And the thing that made it worse was that we'd be on a tractor at the time, roaring loud, rattling metal on metal, plenty of noise that normally makes coyotes or deer vanish long before you get close. Yet whatever was keeping the cattle on edge never seemed bothered by us. It never bolted off at the sound of an engine. It just stayed there, hidden close enough that the herd reacted, but far enough that I never once saw what it was. That was the part that ate at me as a kid. You never saw anything. You'd stand there on the tractor, following the direction the cows were staring, and you'd squint into those trees, looking for the faintest bit of movement. Every shadow looked like something crouched down. Every branch shift made you feel like you'd just missed it moving. And after a while, it didn't matter that you hadn't seen anything. You felt it, that thick, heavy sensation of eyes on you, like the trees themselves were leaning forward, listening. I hated it. I hated how it made me feel. I'd sit there wishing my uncle or my dad would hurry up with whatever they were doing, because I didn't like turning my back on that fence line. I'd try not to look, try to keep myself busy watching the bucket scoop feed or checking the ground for rocks. But my head would snap back to those woods again and again without me meaning to. It was like some instinct I couldn't fight. You didn't want to look, but you couldn't stop. It wasn't as if we had reason to worry about predators, not really. We didn't have bears or mountain lions in the area, not officially anyway, though people said young males would pass through from time to time. I never heard of one sticking around. Coyotes were everywhere, but they were skittish things. They might take a calf if the timing was right and nobody was around, but they weren't bold enough to hang that close with us in the pasture, making all the noise we made. That's why it never quite made sense. Whatever it wasn't scared of us. And that was the part that always lingered in the back of my head. I can remember one evening in particular, late summer, when the air was heavy and still. We were topping off the feeders before heading back home, the sun dropping low and turning the sky orange. The tractor rattled, the feeder gate clanged, and the smell of diesel hung in the heat. Then, just like that, the cattle moved. Not a stampede, not chaos, but sharp and sure. They drifted toward the middle, heads all turning in unison to the tree line, their bodies stiff. I remember how quiet it got under the tractor noise, how the sounds of crickets and birds seemed to fall away. That wall of woods went dark as the sun dipped, and standing there, I felt smaller than I ever had before. I kept turning back over my shoulder, watching, heart hammering for no reason I could name. We didn't talk about it. Not really. If anything, we worked faster when it happened, loading and unloading in half the time, as if getting done quicker might shake off the nerves. My uncle or my dad might glance at the cattle, then at the woods, then back to the tractor, but no one said what we were all thinking. We just wanted to be finished and back on the road. It went on like that all through my childhood. Random, never predictable, but always the same. One day the cattle would be calm, grazing right up near the fence like nothing existed past it. The next day or the next week, they'd be jumpy, uneasy, holding their distance. I got used to it, but I never liked it. And the strange part was, nothing ever happened. We never lost a cow. Never found tracks in the mud that told a story. No shredded carcasses, no signs of struggle. Nothing. Just those moments of tension that left your skin crawling. As I got older, I told myself it was probably just deer. Or maybe hogs rooting through the brush. Something ordinary. Something that would explain it without leaving questions. But the truth is, deep down, I never really believed that. Because if it had been something normal, the cattle would have settled. They wouldn't have acted like that over something they were used to. I don't have an answer for what it was. All I know is that the memory never left me. Even now, thinking back on those days, I can feel it in my chest. That strange mix of silence and noise, the mechanical clatter of a tractor and the heavy stillness of a herd watching something you couldn't see. That pressure in the air, that sharp instinct telling you not to turn your back. The pasture is different now. Time moved on, land got sold, leases changed hands. I don't even know if cattle graze there anymore. But sometimes when I drive past, I slow down and look at the edge of those woods. They haven't changed. Still thick, still dark, still endless. And I know that if I were to stand out there again, I'd feel it all over. That uneasy weight of being watched by something just out of sight. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was everything. I'll never know. All I can tell you is that it was real enough to make a child's skin crawl, real enough to make grown men hurry their work, real enough to stay with me all these years. And when I think about it too long, when I let myself remember, I can almost hear the cattle shifting in the grass, hooves stamping, eyes locked tight on the tree line, waiting for something that never quite showed itself. I always thought I knew my grandpa's farm like the back of my hand. We visited so often when I was a kid that it almost felt like a second home, even though the property itself was so big that I probably only ever saw a fraction of it. My grandpa's land stretched on for what felt like forever, rolling fields of grass and patches of trees, ponds in the low areas, and wire fences running off into the distance until they disappeared from sight. He kept free-range cattle, dozens of them, sometimes more than that depending on the year. They weren't confined to one pasture the way some farms kept them. They roamed across that enormous property, often breaking off into little groups, disappearing into far-off corners of the fields where we couldn't even spot them unless we drove out in the truck. That was one of the strange things about being there. You always knew the cows were out there, but you didn't always see them. Some days you'd walk outside and only spot a few near the barn, chewing grass lazily, their tails swishing at flies. Other days they were completely gone from sight, hidden behind ridges or woods, scattered across hundreds of acres. But you never worried. They belonged to that land as much as the fences and the weathered barn did. The visit I'm thinking about happened when I was younger, sometime in the early 2000s. Back then, my grandparents' house was exactly what you'd picture for a rural farm home. A long dirt driveway led up to it, and the front porch was wide, with creaky wooden steps and rocking chairs faded from years of sun. The paint was peeling in places, and the screen door always had a little squeak to it. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and coffee, and the floors creaked no matter how lightly you walked. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. It felt safe. That day when we pulled up, though, it felt different. My grandparents weren't home. That wasn't unusual. They were always busy with something. Sometimes they'd be out in the truck checking fences, sometimes at the feed store, sometimes just down the road at a neighbor's place. But they always had a spare key hidden on the porch in case family stopped by while they were gone. My mom knew right where it was, tucked in a little metal tin under the edge of a flower pot. We climbed the steps and went inside, expecting the quiet and familiar comfort of the farmhouse. Instead, the second my mom turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door, a noise erupted so loud and piercing it made my chest tighten. The alarm. It wasn't like a regular house alarm you might hear in the city, the kind with steady beeping or an electronic chime. My grandpa had rigged up something for the country. It was a siren, the kind you'd expect to hear for a fire station, or maybe even a tornado warning. It roared to life the moment the door opened, blaring across the empty fields, bouncing off the hills. It was so loud it rattled the windows, and I felt it in my bones more than I heard it in my ears. For a second, I just stood there frozen. My mom was fumbling with the phone, that big heavy rotary one my grandparents still had sitting on a little wooden table by the wall. I always thought that phone was fun to play with, spinning the dial around, listening to it click. But right then, the sound of the alarm was so overwhelming it drowned everything else out. I remember pressing my hands over my ears and looking out the window just to get my mind off it. The view from that side of the house looked out across the wide open field that sloped gently downhill, then flattened out. Beyond that, the land stretched on toward a thin line of trees far in the distance. Usually it was calm and peaceful. That day, though, the sight made my stomach twist. The cows were coming. At first, I thought I was seeing things. Black and brown dots moving in the distance, kicking up dust, spreading out as they rushed forward. Then it hit me, they weren't just moving. They were running. Full speed. From every direction, cows appeared, pouring out from behind ridges, cresting little hills, charging across the open fields with a kind of energy I had never seen in them before. Cows aren't exactly built for speed. Normally, they just plod along, slow and heavy. Sure, they'll trot if they're spooked, but this wasn't trotting. This was a stampede, except they weren't wild or panicked. They were all focused on one thing, the house. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. The ground started to tremble with the force of their hooves. I could feel it through the floorboards, a steady pounding that grew louder and heavier by the second. Dust rose behind them, shimmering in the sunlight. I had never seen so many cows at once, all converging from every side, as if the alarm had called them. Within minutes, they were there. They didn't crash into the house or scatter around it. They stopped. Perfectly. One by one, they took positions, shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid circle around the entire farmhouse. It was eerie how exact it was, like some invisible line had been drawn for them to follow. They weren't mooing or stomping or restless. They just stood there, still and silent, their massive bodies pressed together in a ring. I went to another window, and no matter where I looked, it was the same. Cows in every direction, closing us in. Their heads were turned toward the house, their dark eyes fixed on us. Dozens and dozens of them staring. It should have been funny. If I had been older, maybe I would have laughed at how bizarre it looked, like we were under guard by an army of cows. But in that moment, it felt unsettling. There was something about their silence, about how organized they seemed, that made the hair on my arms stand up. Inside, the siren kept wailing, vibrating through the walls. My mom was still trying to call someone on the rotary phone, shouting into the receiver, but I could hardly hear her over the noise. I stayed by the window, too fascinated and too uneasy to pull away. The cows didn't move. They didn't budge. They just stood there like statues, surrounding us completely. Time stretched out strangely. Maybe it was only 10 or 15 minutes, but it felt like forever. I started to wonder if they would ever move again, if we were just stuck there, trapped in that circle. Finally, though, I saw a cloud of dust on the long dirt road leading up to the house. My grandpa's truck appeared, rumbling toward us. The moment he pulled up and climbed out, something changed. The cows shifted. Not all at once, not in a rush, but gradually, like the spell had broken. They turned away from the house, tails swishing, and began to wander off in different directions. Some trotted a little before slowing down to graze. Others just walked off steadily, spreading back out into the fields. Within minutes, the ring was gone, and the house was no longer surrounded. My grandpa went inside and shut off the alarm, and the sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. My ears were ringing, and the air outside felt strangely heavy, like the weight of all those animals still lingered even after they'd left. Looking back now, it wasn't exactly terrifying. Nothing bad happened. Nobody got hurt. But it was the strangest, most unsettling thing I had ever seen. To this day, I don't know why they did it. Maybe the sound of the alarm spooked them, or maybe it triggered some instinct I didn't understand. All I know is that for those long minutes, standing in that farmhouse, surrounded on every side by silent, staring cattle, it felt like something out of a dream. Something too weird to forget. Even now, years later, when I think about my grandpa's farm, that's the memory that comes back first. Not the smell of hay in the barn, not the taste of sweet corn from the garden, not even the warm evenings on the porch. It's the image of those cows, shoulder to shoulder in a perfect circle, watching us like they were keeping guard, waiting for something only they understood. I remember the night clearer than most birthdays I ever had. I was younger then, maybe early teens, though the exact age doesn't matter as much as the way the whole evening seemed to slow down and fix itself in my memory. My parents had let me have a bonfire out back to celebrate, and a few close friends came over. There weren't many of us, for at least maybe a couple more drifting in and out, but it was enough. We weren't the kind of kids who needed a big party with balloons and cake shaped like cartoon characters. A fire, a field, the open sky, and a night to ourselves felt bigger than anything. The fire crackled bright in the center of us, spitting sparks that drifted upward before vanishing into the dark. I can still smell the smoke on my jacket, even though that jacket has long been lost to time. We had logs and folding chairs pulled around in a rough circle, and someone kept poking at the fire with a stick just to hear the hiss when a damp piece of wood caught flame. It was cool out, not freezing, but enough that the fire pulled us close and made our faces warm while our backs stayed chilled. Behind us was the wide field where horses grazed, their shapes dark against the edge of night. Past them, the land just opened up, rolling slightly downward and out toward the tree line in the distance. Above, the stars spread out in a clear sky with no clouds and no city lights to drown them. It was the kind of night where the stars looked endless, like they stretched forever, close enough you could almost touch them if you climbed high enough. At first it was just normal. We laughed, ate too many marshmallows, threw a couple half-burned sticks into the grass when the flames got too hot to hold. Time moved easily. I don't remember what we were talking about, or even if we were talking at all, but at some point, without really thinking about it, I looked up. Maybe it was quiet just then. Maybe the fire had settled into a calmer burn. Maybe I'd leaned back in my chair and let my eyes drift up. Whatever it was, I lifted my head and the stars caught me. The stars always had a pull. I used to lie on the trampoline in the backyard and watch them, trying to count until I lost track. But this night was different. The sky was so sharp, so full, that it almost pressed down on me. It took a second for me to notice it wasn't just that the stars were beautiful. It was that something was strange. At first I couldn't put my finger on it. I was staring, letting my eyes relax, and then I realized a few of them weren't holding still. They were moving, just slightly, just enough to make me question whether it was my eyes playing tricks. I focused harder, blinking a few times. 3 stars, spaced out in a wide triangle above us, seemed to shift against the still backdrop of the night. It was subtle at first, so subtle I thought maybe it was me swaying in the chair or the firelight making it look that way. But no, the more I stared, the more certain I became. They were moving. Not all of them, just those 3, and they weren't moving in the same way as satellites or airplanes. I'd seen plenty of those, little dots that crept steadily across the sky until they faded. These didn't move steady. They darted. They blinked out and back again. They slid closer together and then stretched apart. It wasn't random. It almost felt like they were connected, like they were aware of each other, forming and reforming that triangular shape. At some point the others must have followed my gaze, because soon enough every one of us was looking up instead of at the fire. I could sense their silence without even glancing at them. The way the group shifted all at once, attention caught. The fire still popped and the night still breathed around us, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, a little faster than it had been. We didn't talk. We didn't laugh. We just watched. Each sudden dart of light made my chest tighten. Each time one of the points disappeared, leaving only two for a moment before returning, I felt a strange drop in my stomach, like when you crest the top of a hill in a car. My eyes strained to keep up with the movements, darting here and there, but I couldn't predict where they'd go next. It wasn't like fireworks or airplanes or shooting stars. Those things had explanations, patterns, reasons that fit neatly into the world I knew. This didn't. This was wrong, or at least outside what I understood. 3 points of light, too steady to be meteors, too fast to be satellites, too deliberate to be illusions, moving in ways I didn't know stars could move. Then, as if to remind us we weren't alone, the horses in the field beside us started to spook. It began with one, a sudden jerk of its head, a restless step backward. Then another. Before long, the whole group of them shifted and snorted, hooves thudding lightly against the ground. I could hear them, restless and uncertain, the sound carrying easily across the field. Horses don't spook for no reason. They're sensitive animals, tuned to things we might miss. Their unease only deepened the knot in my chest. Still, we kept watching. The fire might as well have gone out. The cold on my back didn't matter. Everything narrowed to those 3 lights. When they darted sharply, all of us gasped at the same time, a sound that broke the silence like glass shattering. It was proof. Proof I wasn't imagining it, proof we all saw the same thing. Each sudden flash, each bright flare, each impossible movement was met with the same sharp intake of breath from all of us, a rhythm of disbelief that kept repeating. I tried, for a while, to explain it away in my head. There's a name, I thought, some phenomenon that makes stars look like they're shifting when you stare too long. I'd heard of it before, the way your eyes can trick you because the points of light are so small. I clung to that explanation like a rope, telling myself over and over that it was just that. Just a trick of sight, a quirk of human perception. Nothing more. But the more I tried to believe it, the more it slipped through my fingers. Because tricks of sight don't make horses restless. Tricks of sight don't cause a whole group of people to gasp at the same second when a star suddenly vanishes or flares bright. Tricks of sight don't move 3 points of light together in a pattern that holds, breaks, and reforms. The night stretched on, though I couldn't tell you how long we sat there. Time seemed strange, suspended, caught between one moment and the next. At some point the fire dropped low, glowing red instead of flaming bright, but none of us cared. We stayed locked on the sky, waiting for the next movement, the next impossible shift. My neck grew stiff from craning upward, but I didn't dare look away. I was caught, and I think the others were too. Eventually, as quietly as it began, it slowed. The lights didn't blink out all at once, didn't vanish dramatically. They just stopped. One moment they were darting and flaring, the next they were still, fixed in the sky like any other stars. They held there, calm, steady, unremarkable. We waited, tense, certain another movement would come. But it didn't. The triangle stayed, unmoving, until it blended into the rest of the endless stars above. The horses settled down too, their movements softening until the night felt normal again. The air cooled further, the field lay quiet, and the fire dimmed. Slowly, reluctantly, our gazes drifted back to earth. It was as if some invisible grip had released us, letting us breathe again. The night carried on. Nothing more happened. For years afterward, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Just that phenomenon I couldn't remember the name of. A trick of eyes and minds. I repeated it like a shield, telling myself it made sense. I wanted it to make sense. But every time I think back, the shield cracks. I remember the way we all gasped at the same second. I remember the horses spooking, hooves restless in the dark. I remember the triangle, 3 points moving in a dance that didn't belong to the sky I knew. And I remember that it wasn't just me. We all saw it. We all felt it. Whatever it was real. That's the part that stays with me. Not the fire, not the birthday, not even the cold night air. It's that triangle above us, those 3 impossible stars, and the silence of a group of kids who suddenly realized the sky might hold things we weren't ready to understand. I grew up on a small piece of land that my parents liked to call a hobby farm. It wasn't a real farm by any stretch, not like the kind where people depended on crops or livestock to survive, but it was more than just a big backyard too. We had animals, and not just one kind. Chickens, goats, a few ducks, even a couple of pigs at one point. Later on, my dad bought a pair of cows, and my mom always seemed to be taking in stray dogs or cats that ended up roaming the property. The animals were more for the joy of keeping them and teaching us responsibility than for making money. My dad worked full-time in town, and my mom stayed busy with us kids and the land. It was quiet most of the time, a little isolated, with fields stretching out past the fence lines and woods that pressed close on one side of the property. The house itself was old. 2 stories, white paint that always seemed in need of fresh coats, and a wide front porch with wooden planks that creaked under your feet. That porch became one of my favorite spots as a teenager. I'd lean against the railing with a phone in my hand, talking for hours about nothing important. It was the kind of place where you could hear the wind run through the trees, the chickens clucking in their coop, or the goats butting heads in the pasture. But it was also the kind of place where the silence could feel heavier than you wanted, especially if you were alone. I remember one afternoon when I was maybe 15 or 16. The house was empty except for me. My parents had taken my younger siblings into town for groceries and errands, and I'd begged to stay behind. I liked the solitude sometimes. I stretched out my time on the phone with cousins and friends, gossiping, laughing about dumb jokes, pacing the porch barefoot in the late sunlight. The air smelled like cut grass and animal feed, and the boards beneath me were warm from the day's heat. I don't even remember what I was laughing about when it happened. Something stupid, the kind of thing you forget 5 minutes later. But I know the exact sound of my laugh when I caught a flicker of motion out of the corner of my right eye. At first it didn't register. The way something brushes past your vision, and you think it's a trick of light or a bird darting low. But then my brain caught up with my eyes, and I turned my head just enough to catch the blur before it disappeared around the far side of the house. It looked like a man, or at least shaped like one. Upright, tall, but covered in hair like an animal. I didn't see a face, just this thick dark mass and long limbs pumping hard as it ran. The speed of it is what jolted me, faster than anything should have been able to move on 2 legs. It crossed that open space in a heartbeat, too quick for me to get a real look, but enough that my body reacted before my mind could make sense of it. My chest dropped cold, and my skin prickled like it was on fire. I froze on the porch, phone still pressed to my ear, though I wasn't listening anymore. My heart slammed against my ribs, that deep thudding that makes you feel like your chest is vibrating. I had this instant panic that I can only compare to when you nearly crash a car or almost step into traffic. Pure survival fear. My hand went slack and the phone tumbled against my leg, the voice on the other end muffled, but I wasn't hearing anything anymore. My legs took over, carrying me inside without a second thought. I slammed the screen door behind me and stood just inside, gasping like I'd run a mile. My palms were sweaty, my knees trembling, and my ears felt sharp, like every sound was turned up. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I darted to the windows, pulling back the curtains with shaky fingers, looking out at every angle I could. I expected to see something, someone out there, maybe hiding behind the barn, crouching near the chicken coop, or sprinting across the pasture. But there was nothing, just the same quiet land I'd seen 1,000 times, only now it felt strange and hostile. I went room to room, upstairs and down, peeking out every window that gave me a different view of the property. My eyes kept catching movement that wasn't there, branches swaying in the breeze, shadows shifting in the barn, animals shifting in their pens. Every one of those moments made my stomach tighten, but I never saw that blur again. After a while, I realized I was still clutching the phone. My cousin's voice was faint on the line, asking if I was still there. I hung up without saying a word. My throat felt tight and dry. I sat down in the living room with my back against the wall, staring at the door like I was daring it to open. I stayed that way for a long time, counting my breaths, listening for footsteps on the porch or scratches at the door. Nothing came. The rest of that day felt endless. My parents didn't get home until late evening, and I jumped out of my skin when I heard their car crunching up the driveway. I didn't tell them what I saw. I don't even know why. Maybe because I couldn't explain it in a way that sounded normal. Maybe because I thought they'd laugh or dismiss it. So I kept it to myself. I forced myself to eat dinner, pretending everything was fine, but I barely tasted the food. When I went up to bed, I kept the blinds shut tight, but that didn't stop me from lying awake, listening for something running through the yard. For weeks after that, I couldn't step outside without scanning the tree line. The porch, which used to feel like my spot, turned into a place I avoided if I was alone. I started sitting in the kitchen when I talked on the phone, near the back door where I could bolt upstairs or into the pantry if I needed. I'd glance out the windows constantly, expecting that flash of movement to appear again. But it never did. Whatever I saw that day, it didn't come back. Or at least, not where I could see it. Looking back, I can't say for sure what I saw. I've replayed that moment so many times in my head, wondering if it was just my mind twisting something ordinary into something terrifying. Could it have been a neighbor messing around? We didn't have many close neighbors, and none of them were the type to run half-naked across someone's yard. Could it have been an animal? Maybe a big dog, though no dog runs upright like that. A deer maybe? But it didn't move like a deer. It moved like a person, only too fast, too fluid. The thing that unsettles me most is how sharp that feeling of panic was. I've been startled before, by snakes in the grass, by strangers stepping too close, but this was different. It was like my body recognized danger before my brain did. That cold jolt of knowing something isn't right. Even now, years later, when I picture the blur of dark hair streaking past the corner of my vision, I can feel that same rush of fear in my chest. I never saw it again, and life went back to normal eventually. The animals still needed feeding, the grass still needed mowing, and I still spent plenty of time on the phone. But I never stood on that porch without thinking about it, never leaned against the railing without glancing at the side of the house. And even though nothing else ever happened, the memory stuck. It's one of those moments that doesn't fade, no matter how much you try to reason it away. Maybe it was nothing more than my imagination, stretched thin from being alone too long. Maybe it was just some animal that my brain twisted into the shape of something worse. But maybe it wasn't. All I know is that I saw something that day, something I can't explain, and it left me with a fear I hadn't known before. A fear that made me realize that even in the place I thought I knew best, the place that felt safe and ordinary, there are still moments when you don't understand what's right in front of you. Moments that remind you how quickly safety can feel like a fragile illusion. And to this day, when I think back to that farm, with its fields and its animals and that creaking front porch, the first thing that comes to mind isn't the good memories. It's that blur of motion, that sudden cold panic, and the way I never found out what it was. I still remember that night clear as day, the kind of memory that burns itself into you because of how uneasy it makes you feel. I had been out of town for the day, nothing unusual about it, just a long day away from home and ready to finally get some rest. It was already late when I was headed back, the highway mostly empty except for the occasional set of headlights flashing by in the opposite direction. I was halfway home when my phone rang, and it was my dad. He asked if I could swing by the field and shut some irrigation valves off before heading in. It wasn't a big job, something I'd done hundreds of times before, and I agreed without even thinking twice. Shutting off the valves wasn't complicated, just like turning off a faucet at the start of each row. Usually we'd have 20 or 30 of them running, and whoever got stuck with the job would just work their way down the line. Normally, I'd bring a flashlight along when I had to do it at night, but this time I didn't have one. I figured I could just use the headlights from my pickup to see what I was doing. Not ideal, but it would work. When I pulled into the field, it was pitch black except for the lights from the truck. The field stretched wide and flat, nothing but rows and rows of ground with water running through them, and beyond that the open night. I pulled the truck up to the first valve, left the engine idling, and the headlights lit up the nearest stretch. The ground glistened where the water had pooled, the shine of wet soil reflecting the light. I started working my way down, bending to shut off the valves one by one. The first few were easy enough, the headlights catching me just right, so I didn't need anything else. The cool metal was slick under my hands, damp from the water that had been running all evening. The smell of wet earth and river water hung in the air, mixed with the faint scent of diesel from my pickup's exhaust. About halfway down, though, something changed. At first I thought maybe a cloud had passed over the moon, even though the headlights were my main light source. It just went darker in an odd way. The light on my left side seemed to vanish, like something had stepped right in front of it. Instinct made me whip around fast, and that's when I noticed it. Something tall enough to completely block out the passenger side headlight, was moving across in front of the truck. It didn't stop, didn't hesitate, just crossed steady and smooth. My eyes locked onto the shape, though it was mostly shadow, and just as I caught sight of it, it reached the other side and blocked the driver's side light too. For 3 long seconds, maybe less, it was right there in the beams. Not a sound came from it. No crunch of dirt underfoot, no splash in the water, nothing. Just movement. Then it was gone, swallowed by the dark as if it had never been there. My chest tightened, and for a second I thought I might have imagined it. The whole thing happened so quickly, so silently, that I was left standing there with my hands still gripping the metal valve and my pulse pounding in my ears. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, to put it into a shape I recognized. A big coyote, I told myself. Had to be. Maybe a deer cutting across. Something with fur, something common enough for the area. That's what I settled on because the alternative was too strange to think about. I finished shutting the rest of the valves a lot faster than I usually would have, kept glancing over my shoulder every few seconds like whatever I saw might come back. By the time I climbed into the truck, my palms were sweaty, and I could feel my shirt clinging to my back. I told myself again it was just a coyote, a big one maybe, but still just a coyote. Nothing worth losing sleep over. But the thing is, that wasn't the only time something out there unsettled me. The strangest thing I ever saw didn't even happen at night. It happened in broad daylight. It was one of those clear days when you spend hours out in the field, sun on your back, dust clinging to your jeans. My dad and I were planting trees along the edge of the property, not far from the river. The river was always a part of life out there, running alongside the fields, sometimes flooding in spring, other times dropping low enough to wade across in spots. That day it looked normal enough, water catching the sunlight and drifting past with the slow weight of late spring. We had the truck parked close to the bank, a few saplings waiting in the bed, and I was pulling tools out when movement caught my eye downriver. At first I thought it was just some dogs messing around. We had plenty of strays out there, and it wasn't unusual to see a group of them running together. But these weren't just running. They were attacking something in the water. It caught my attention right away because we'd had our own dogs attacked by strays before, and my mom always broke down over it. Seeing that scene play out again, even from a distance, made my stomach drop. The way the strays were lunging and splashing, circling whatever they had cornered, it looked bad. My first thought was that it had to be one of our dogs. I yelled for my dad to back the truck closer to the bank. I don't know if I even thought it through or if I just reacted, but the sight of those strays tearing at something lit a fire under me. He backed us up, and as soon as I had the chance, I grabbed a rock from the ground, a decent-sized one, and hurled it toward the mess. It splashed nearby, and for a second the dogs paused, startled. Then I threw another. That did it. They scattered, splashing and scrambling up the bank, disappearing into the brush like smoke on the wind. The thing they'd been attacking dragged itself free of the water and scrambled onto the bank across from me. At first, I braced myself to see a mangled dog, maybe torn up but still breathing. But when it rose out of the water and staggered onto its legs, I froze. It wasn't a dog I'd ever seen before. It stood chest high, dripping wet, its skin completely hairless. Not bald in patches like mange, but bare all over, slick and raw-looking under the sunlight. Its legs were too thin, too long, like spindly deer legs trying to hold up the bulk of a body that didn't quite fit them. Its head had the rough shape of a dog's, but the proportions were wrong. The snout was blocky, almost rectangular, too wide and too straight to look natural. Its ears stood straight up, alert, but they were just a little too big, stretched tall in a way that made it look unnatural, like someone had pulled them out of proportion. It stumbled, legs jerking as if they didn't belong to it, and then collapsed halfway into a bush. For a moment, it just sat there, dripping and panting, then it turned its head back toward me. I'll never forget the way it looked at me. Not scared, not angry, just tired, like it had been through hell and was barely hanging on. I froze, gripping the side of the truck, unsure whether to climb in or stand my ground. The thing blinked once, slow, then pushed itself unsteadily into the brush. Branches shook, leaves rustled, and then it was gone, swallowed up by the riverbank thicket. My chest felt like it had caved in. My dad looked shaken too, though neither of us said much at the time. We just stood there for a long minute, staring at the place where it disappeared. The only thing we could get out was the same thought, the same words. What the hell was that? For weeks after, my dad went on about chupacabras. He pulled up pictures online, read out articles, even compared sketches to what I had seen. Some of them, I'll admit, looked eerily close. But I never really believed it was anything like that. I think what I saw was real, just an animal, only sick or mutated in some way I couldn't place. Something with mange so bad it stripped it bare, maybe malnourished to the point its body was stretched wrong. And yet, I can still see it in my head, clear as anything. That hairless skin, those spindly legs, that block-shaped snout. I know what sick dogs look like. I know what deer look like. That thing didn't fit into either category neatly. I try to tell myself it was just an animal in rough shape, something nature had beaten down until it didn't look right anymore. That's what makes the most sense. But the truth is, I don't know. And not knowing sticks with you. It creeps into your head when you're out there at night alone, when the brush rustles, when the headlights catch a shadow at the edge of the field. Every time I shut valves now, I bring a flashlight. And every time I pass the river, I can't help but glance down at the bank, half expecting to see something rising up from the water again. Something I'll never be able to explain. I grew up in a small town where the houses were close enough to feel like a neighborhood, but just beyond our backyard stretched rows and rows of farmland. I wasn't a farmer and neither was my family, but the land behind us belonged to a farmer who worked the soil year after year. To me as a kid, those fields weren't just crops. They were like an endless playground. My brother and I would wait for the summer months when the cornstalks shot up tall and thick, forming walls that towered over our heads. Walking between them felt like stepping into a secret world, hidden from everything else. Our mom never knew where we really went. She thought we played at the little park a block away, the one with a rusted swing set and a basketball hoop without a net. She would never have let us roam around in a farmer's fields, but we were kids, and kids look for adventures wherever they can find them. The park was too open, too ordinary. The cornfield was alive, full of smells and sounds, with dirt paths carved by machines, stalks swaying above us, and that feeling of being in a maze that only we knew how to escape from. On one particular day, I remember the sky was bright and clear, the kind of day where the sun made the dirt dry and hard, and the green of the corn seemed to glow. My brother was older than me, stronger too, and he always led the way. I followed close, brushing my hands against the rough leaves, hearing the crickets and the occasional rustle of a bird darting out. The rows stretched straight and perfect, disappearing into the distance. We didn't have a plan. We never really did. We just wandered, sometimes making paths by weaving left and right, sometimes challenging ourselves to see how far we could go without turning back. It was easy to forget that these weren't our fields, that the crops weren't toys or walls built for us to play between. It felt like they were, though, because once you stepped inside, the outside world disappeared. The houses, the roads, even the sound of cars, they all faded. All that remained was the green around us, the dirt below us, and the sky above that peeked through in strips. We had been walking for what felt like a long time when I first noticed it. A sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving the stalks in a certain way, but then it grew steadier. It was mechanical, low at first, almost like a hum that blended into the background. My brother stopped, tilting his head, and we both listened. It wasn't like the sound of a car on the road. It was deeper, more rhythmic. The kind of sound that repeats with weight behind it. We couldn't see anything past the walls of corn, so after a moment my brother crouched a little and told me to climb onto his shoulders. I scrambled up, holding onto his head to steady myself, and then I could see above the stalks. What I saw made my stomach tighten, even though I didn't fully understand the danger at that age. Not too far from where we were, a combine was moving steadily through the field. I didn't know the right word for it then. I just thought of it as a big harvest tractor, but it was unmistakable. Huge, loud, chewing through row after row of corn, its wide header pulling the stalks in like they were nothing. And the worst part was how close it was. It wasn't slowly making its way toward us from some far-off spot. It was already not that many rows away, and it was coming fast. I climbed down quickly, my heart racing even though I didn't know why I was so nervous. I told my brother that the big harvest tractor was coming, and without even questioning me, he grabbed my arm and started pulling me through the rows. My first instinct was to run straight back toward where I thought the edge of the field was, to head directly for home. But my brother was smarter than me in that moment. He didn't drag us in a straight line. He pulled me to the side, away from the machine's path, deeper into the maze of corn where it wouldn't roll right over us. At the time, I didn't feel the fear I do now thinking back on it. I was more excited, almost like it was part of the adventure. The ground was rough beneath our shoes, clumps of dirt and stray roots trying to trip us as we ran. The leaves of the corn whipped against our faces and arms, leaving little scratches. The air was hot, and the sound of the combine grew louder with every passing second. I remember the way the engine roared, steady and unforgiving, and how the snapping and crunching of the stalks being devoured seemed to echo everywhere. We ran until my chest burned and I could barely breathe. When we finally stopped, crouching low between the rows, the sound of the machine was overwhelming. It was so close I felt like the ground was trembling beneath us. My brother pressed a hand against my shoulder to keep me still, and together we waited, crouched in the dirt, listening. Through the gaps in the stalks, I could see glimpses of it as it passed. Massive tires rolled over the earth, flattening anything in their way. The header kept swallowing the rows, chopping them down without pause. The driver, whoever he was, couldn't see us. He wasn't looking for kids hiding in the corn. To him, the field was just work, just something to harvest, and we would have been nothing but two tiny figures lost in all that green. If we had been in front of it, directly in its path, there's no way he would have known until it was too late. The machine passed by, row after row falling, and for a long time I held my breath, afraid that even a cough would give us away. The heat, the dust, and the smell of oil and cut plants filled the air. I wiped sweat from my face, my hands trembling, even though I didn't fully understand the weight of what almost happened. When it finally moved farther away, the sound fading little by little as it continued its work on another section of the field, my brother stood up first. He brushed the dirt from his knees and looked around, making sure it was safe. Then we made our way carefully back, slower this time, until we finally saw the open space beyond the rows. Stepping out of that green wall back into daylight felt like stepping out of a tunnel. The houses, the road, the ordinary world, they all came back into view. We never told our mom about it. She would have been furious, not just because we were trespassing, but because of how close we had come to real danger. At the time, it felt like another adventure, something to laugh about once the noise of the machine was far behind us. But as I've gotten older, the memory has changed in my mind. Now, when I think back to that day, I don't feel the excitement. I feel the weight of what could have happened. We could have been in its path, unseen and unheard, with no chance to escape in time. A combine isn't built to stop quickly. It isn't built to notice two kids hiding in the stalks. Looking back, the thought chills me. The adventure we thought was harmless could have ended in silence, swallowed up in the noise of an engine and the crash of corn being torn down. I don't step into cornfields anymore. Even now, when I drive past them in late summer and see the stalks standing tall, part of me remembers being lost in the green walls with that sound growing louder and closer. It taught me something that's never left me, that some dangers don't come with warnings or second chances. Sometimes you're just lucky enough to step aside in time. That day, my brother pulled me out of the path without hesitation. I didn't realize it then, but he might have saved both our lives.